Royal Guard Strips CAMILLA'S son of his title, after Princess Charlotte went missing for 48 hours. Born into a family closely linked to the royal household, he had access to privileges and luxuries that made his childhood look like something out of a storybook. Grand halls, sprawling gardens, private tutors, and endless attention from palace staff were a part of his everyday life. Yet, despite the glittering surroundings and the admiration of strangers, Edward often felt a weight pressing on him. Expectations were everywhere: what to wear, how to speak, and how to behave. Every smile, every word, every action was measured against an invisible standard. Edward was 15 now, an age where most teenagers wrestle with schoolwork, friendships, and hobbies. But for him, the ordinary challenges were magnified by the glare of public interest. Even in the quiet moments of his day, he knew someone was always watching, whether it was a royal aide, a palace guard, or even the eyes of the media through distant cameras. He learned early on that mistakes could be noticed, remembered, and judged, not just by those around him but by the whole country. That pressure often made him restless, seeking small escapes wherever he could find them. His mother, Camilla, watched him carefully. She knew the importance of guiding him, but she also understood that he needed room to grow and make choices on his own. She tried to balance discipline with freedom, often reminding him that life in the royal environment was unlike any ordinary childhood. "Edward," she would say gently, "you are part of something bigger than yourself, but you are also your own person. Don't forget that." Her words were meant to encourage him, but Edward sometimes found them heavy, a reminder that his actions carried consequences far beyond what any normal teenager might face. Despite the constant guidance, Edward loved adventure and curiosity. He was fascinated by the hidden corners of the palace: the old library with its towering shelves, the small courtyards tucked away behind walls, and the tiny gardens where only a few staff members went. He often imagined what it would be like to explore the world outside the palace gates, a place where rules felt looser and freedom tasted sweeter. But the palace was not a playground. Every doorway had locks, every path had rules, and every garden had a guard. Edward had learned to navigate carefully, respecting boundaries while finding moments to satisfy his curiosity. Princess Charlotte, a few years younger than Edward, was a bright and cheerful presence in the palace. She had a keen mind, a lively spirit, and an affectionate heart. Unlike Edward, she rarely challenged rules or sought adventures beyond the usual spaces. She loved her toys, her books, and the company of the small circle of people she trusted. Her days were full of laughter, gentle routines, and the safe predictability of palace life. While Edward often chafed against restrictions, Charlotte seemed to thrive within them, understanding that safety and structure were essential, even if it meant giving up some freedom. On a Thursday morning, the palace was unusually quiet. Edward had finished breakfast early and decided to take a walk in the gardens, a familiar habit that gave him a sense of calm before the day's official events began. The sun was soft, filtering through the high trees, casting long shadows on the cobblestone paths. Birds chirped quietly, and the fountains glimmered in the morning light. Edward walked with a sense of ease, feeling the gentle breeze on his face and listening to the subtle sounds of the palace coming to life. As he wandered, he noticed Charlotte playing nearby. She was building a small tower with her blocks on a soft patch of grass, humming a tune to herself. Edward watched her for a moment, smiling at her focus and innocence. He remembered his own younger years, when he would spend hours building castles with blocks or exploring the same gardens with wide-eyed curiosity. There was a warmth in watching her play, a reminder of the simple joys that still existed amidst the pressures of palace life. Yet in that quiet moment, Edward's restless nature began to stir. He felt a tug in his mind, a desire to explore beyond the familiar paths. There were small gates along the edge of the gardens, some of which were meant only for staff access. He knew he wasn't supposed to open them, but the curiosity inside him whispered that nothing terrible would happen if he just peeked. It was that small, dangerous thought that often led to trouble in moments of carelessness. Edward shook his head, trying to push it away, but the idea lingered, tempting him to step beyond the boundaries he had been taught to respect. Meanwhile, the staff were busy with their morning routines, preparing the palace for the day. Guards patrolled the hallways, aides carried documents, and the kitchens filled the air with the aroma of freshly baked bread and warm tea. Everyone moved with a practiced rhythm, aware of the importance of their duties. Edward knew they would notice if he stepped out of line, but he also believed he could be careful, that he could satisfy his curiosity without causing any real harm. It was a dangerous mix of confidence and inexperience, one that would soon have consequences. Edward approached one of the smaller gates that led to a section of the garden usually reserved for staff. The metal latch was simple, easy to lift if one knew how. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Charlotte, who was still engrossed in her play. The sight of her, innocent and unaware, should have reminded him of his responsibility, but the allure of exploring something new was strong. With a quick motion, he lifted the latch and pushed the gate open. The world beyond seemed ordinary, almost mundane, yet thrilling because it was forbidden. He stepped through the gate, feeling a rush of excitement. The path beyond was narrow and lined with hedges, leading to an area of the palace grounds that few ever visited. Edward felt a sense of adventure, imagining himself as a hero in a story, discovering hidden treasures and secret paths. He didn't notice the small sign warning of restricted access, nor did he think about the rules he had been taught. In that moment, the thrill of freedom outweighed caution. Charlotte, meanwhile, continued to play, unaware that the small gate her brother had opened was a portal to potential danger. She laughed as a butterfly landed near her blocks, reaching out to touch it gently. The world around her was safe, familiar, and comforting. She had no reason to suspect that the quiet morning was about to change dramatically. Edward, now beyond the gate, felt both excitement and a hint of guilt. He knew that if he were caught, there would be consequences, but he convinced himself that he was careful enough to avoid trouble. He wandered along the path, peering into corners and imagining stories about what might have happened in this part of the palace decades ago. The thrill of exploration, combined with the innocence of curiosity, made him feel alive in a way that his usual routines did not. At that moment, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The simple act of curiosity, the small decision to step beyond a boundary, was about to trigger a chain of events that would test Edward, Charlotte, and the entire palace. What began as a quiet, sunny morning was on the brink of becoming a story of tension, responsibility, and lessons that neither Edward nor anyone else in the palace would forget soon. It started as a quiet morning, but soon, worry began to creep through the palace. Princess Charlotte, who had been playing happily with her blocks, was nowhere to be found. At first, the staff thought she had simply moved to another part of the nursery, or perhaps she had wandered to a different playroom under the supervision of a caretaker. But when minutes stretched into half an hour with no sign of her, concern grew. The aides began to search the rooms carefully, calling her name softly, hoping she was simply hiding or playing a game of make-believe. Edward, meanwhile, was still wandering through the restricted part of the gardens, unaware of the growing tension inside the palace. The excitement of discovery had carried him forward, and he was peering into small alcoves and empty hallways that had not been visited in years. For Edward, the morning felt like a grand adventure, a story unfolding with each step. He had no sense yet that his actions had consequences that would ripple far beyond his imagination. Back in the nursery, a staff member's concern turned urgent. "Charlotte," the nanny called again, her voice rising slightly with panic. The usual soft footsteps of the princess responding to her name were absent. The aides exchanged worried glances. One of them ran to alert Camilla, who was in the adjoining wing overseeing the morning routines. The color drained from her face as she realized something was wrong. A mother's intuition told her immediately that her daughter was missing. She rushed to the nursery, trying not to panic, yet her heart was beating fast. Camilla quickly informed the palace security team. The guards, trained for emergency situations, mobilized instantly. Surveillance cameras were checked, and every corridor and courtyard was scanned for any sign of the princess. But the footage only showed Charlotte leaving her play area for a brief moment, then disappearing from view. Panic began to rise in the palace staff. Though the grounds were large and well protected, the fact that a young child could go missing, even briefly, was a nightmare scenario. Edward, unaware of the growing crisis, turned a corner and discovered a small path leading toward the palace gates. The sense of adventure still carried him forward, even as a small voice inside warned him to turn back. He had never gone this far before. The path was narrow and lined with tall hedges, and he imagined that if anyone came looking, they would never find him. The thrill of secrecy was intoxicating, making him feel powerful, clever, and a little bit brave. Meanwhile, the palace was in full alarm. The security team had begun to check every gate and exit. They realized that a small service gate had been found slightly ajar. Questions immediately arose. Who had opened it? How had a child gained access? Guards began to move quickly, checking every possible exit point, contacting nearby authorities and informing higher officials within the royal household. Camilla paced anxiously, her mind racing through every possible scenario. She was terrified but tried to remain calm in front of the staff, knowing that panic would not help find her daughter. Edward, following the path beyond the gate, began to feel the first stirrings of unease. The gardens here were unfamiliar and quiet, too quiet. He realized that he might be in trouble if someone saw him. The initial excitement of exploration was now mixed with a subtle fear, the kind that comes when one understands that they are far from safety. Yet curiosity still held him in its grip. He told himself that he would quickly explore and then return to the familiar paths. He did not yet realize how long those minutes would stretch or how deeply his actions would affect everyone around him. Back at the palace, aides were conducting a methodical search. Each staff member had a specific area to cover, from the tallest towers to the smallest corridors. Guards checked the gardens, gates, and perimeter walls. The queen herself had been informed, and while she remained composed in public, in private she was deeply concerned. The disappearance of a child in the palace grounds was a rare and serious incident, one that required careful handling and immediate action. Every moment that passed without finding Charlotte increased the urgency. Charlotte, meanwhile, had wandered a short distance from where Edward had opened the gate. She had been curious about the butterfly that had landed near her blocks and had followed it instinctively toward the hedge. The child's mind was full of wonder, completely unaware of the potential danger. She laughed as she stepped over small stones and ran after the butterfly, unaware of the time passing and the growing alarm within the palace. For Charlotte, this was a simple adventure, a continuation of her playful morning. Edward realized he had traveled far enough and decided it was time to turn back. But when he tried to retrace his steps, the path seemed different, confusing, and unfamiliar. The hedges and small walls, which had seemed manageable moments ago, now created a maze-like effect. Edward's heart began to beat faster. The first real fear of the morning touched him, a feeling that his adventure might have consequences he could not control. He began calling out softly for Charlotte, hoping she had not gone too far and that they could find each other quickly. Inside the palace, tension reached a peak. The security team expanded their search outside the immediate grounds, coordinating with local police and authorities. Messages were sent to surrounding neighborhoods, alerting them to a missing child. The media, which had not yet picked up the story, was kept at bay to avoid creating panic among the public. The palace staff worked tirelessly, checking every possible area, retracing steps, and questioning anyone who had been near the gardens that morning. Edward finally heard a small sound, a giggle. Relief flooded him as he realized it was Charlotte. She had been following a butterfly and had not noticed the time or the danger. He ran toward her, calling her name gently. Charlotte turned and saw him, her eyes wide, realizing for the first time that she had wandered far from safety. She rushed to Edward, and together they began to find their way back. The relief of seeing her brother reassured her, and she held his hand tightly as they navigated the confusing path. The palace staff, watching the cameras and communicating through radios, noticed movement near the restricted gate. Guards quickly moved to intercept, ensuring that both children were safe. When Edward and Charlotte finally emerged from the hidden path, the tension in the palace broke slightly, replaced by a mix of relief and stern concern. The children were unharmed, but the seriousness of the situation was clear to everyone. The simple act of curiosity had turned into a palace-wide emergency. Camilla rushed forward, her heart still racing, and hugged Charlotte tightly. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered reassuring words, grateful that her daughter was safe. At the same time, she looked at Edward, a mixture of relief and concern washing over her. "You must understand how serious this is," she said gently but firmly. Edward nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him for the first time in a real way. The palace held a quiet meeting later that morning to review what had happened. Security measures were checked, gates were locked, and protocols were reinforced. Edward was spoken to privately, reminded of the rules and expectations, and encouraged to think carefully about how his curiosity could have consequences. Though there was no malice in his actions, the incident served as a powerful lesson for him, and a reminder to everyone that even small mistakes could have serious repercussions. By the end of the day, the palace returned to its normal routines, but the memory of the morning lingered. Edward and Charlotte had learned valuable lessons, Charlotte about being aware of her surroundings, Edward about the weight of responsibility. The staff and security teams remained vigilant, ensuring that nothing like this would happen again. The quiet of the palace was restored, but the story of that day would be remembered, a moment that highlighted both the innocence of childhood and the importance of careful attention in a world filled with responsibility. The morning's chaos had settled into an uneasy calm, but the weight of the events still hung heavily over the palace. Edward sat quietly in a small, sunlit room, his hands folded on his lap. He was silent, a rare moment for someone usually full of restless energy. The thrill of his morning adventure had vanished, replaced by a creeping awareness of how serious the situation had been. For the first time, he realized that actions, even those taken with curiosity or innocence, could carry consequences far beyond his imagination. Camilla had insisted that he remain in the room while palace security and advisors reviewed what had happened. Edward knew she was worried, but he also understood that her concern went deeper than mere fear. It was disappointment, a quiet but heavy weight that he could feel pressing on his chest. "Edward," she said softly, "I know you didn't mean any harm, but this could have ended very differently. You must understand that you are part of a family and a world where your actions matter, not just to yourself, but to everyone around you." Her words were gentle, yet firm, leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. Outside the room, the palace was abuzz with activity. Security officers reviewed surveillance footage over and over, noting every detail of Edward and Charlotte's movements. They identified exactly where the small gate had been left unlatched and tracked the paths the children had taken. While no harm had come to Charlotte, the breach of protocol was serious. Discussions were underway about how such an event could be prevented in the future, but there was also a quiet undercurrent of frustration. The palace had rules for a reason, and the near miss that morning had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Edward listened as his name was mentioned several times, though he could not hear the full conversations. The gravity of being directly involved in a palace-wide incident began to settle over him. For the first time, he considered what could have happened if Charlotte had wandered further, if she had been outside the walls entirely. Fear and regret crept in, mingling with the earlier excitement he had felt. He realized that his curiosity, though innocent in intent, had endangered someone he loved deeply. Camilla remained at his side, offering quiet support. She knew that punishing Edward harshly in the moment would not teach him what he needed to understand. Instead, she focused on helping him process the incident, guiding him toward awareness and reflection. "It is not enough to feel sorry," she said gently. "You need to think about what you can do differently next time, how you can be responsible. This is not just about rules, it is about keeping people safe, including yourself." Edward nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson with a growing sense of accountability. Meanwhile, the palace advisors were meeting in one of the larger chambers. They discussed the event in meticulous detail, considering the implications for security, public perception, and the family's reputation. The incident was serious not just because a child had gone missing, but because it highlighted a moment of carelessness within the palace itself. Questions were raised about supervision, training, and whether additional measures should be implemented to prevent a recurrence. Some advisors suggested stricter rules for Edward. Others considered the importance of teaching him responsibility through structured reflection and guidance. One senior security officer spoke cautiously but firmly. The gate should never have been accessible, and yet it was. While Edward's intentions were innocent, the result was a breach in our protocols. We need to ensure this does not happen again. His words carried weight, and those present nodded in agreement. It was clear that the incident would not be brushed aside lightly, nor would it be forgotten quickly. Every detail was being examined, not to assign blame unfairly, but to learn how to strengthen the system and prevent future mistakes. Edward could hear the discussion in fragments through the slightly ajar door. He felt a mixture of guilt and anxiety, but also a sense of understanding that his actions had consequences that extended beyond himself. He realized that being part of a family, especially one so visible and influential, meant that every choice mattered. Even a small act of curiosity could ripple outward, affecting not just the immediate situation but the perception and security of the entire household. The advisors eventually turned their attention to Camilla. They recognized that she would need to guide Edward through the aftermath. She was asked to consider measures that would balance discipline with learning, ensuring that Edward would internalize the lesson rather than simply fear punishment. "He must understand responsibility," one advisor said. "But we also need him to grow, to become someone who can think clearly under pressure. Fear alone will not teach him that." Camilla agreed, nodding thoughtfully. Later that afternoon, Edward was asked to speak with a small group of palace mentors, individuals chosen to help young members of the family navigate challenges and understand the responsibilities of their position. They sat in a quiet room, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and Edward listened as they explained the importance of rules, vigilance, and foresight. They spoke calmly but clearly about the morning's events, emphasizing that the outcome had been fortunate, but luck could not be relied upon in the future. Edward felt a new sense of respect for the role of responsibility. He began to understand that rules were not arbitrary. They existed to protect those he loved and the world he was part of. While he had previously seen restrictions as frustrating or limiting, he now recognized their purpose. Every step he took could have consequences, and it was his duty to ensure that those consequences were positive rather than dangerous. Camilla observed him closely throughout the discussion. She saw the subtle shift in his demeanor, the seriousness in his expression, the thoughtful pauses before he spoke, the way he asked careful questions. While he was still a teenager full of curiosity and energy, there was now a deeper awareness present. She allowed herself a small sigh of relief, knowing that Edward was beginning to internalize the lesson, even if the full understanding would take time to develop. As the day continued, the palace staff worked to reinforce security measures. Gates were checked, doors were secured, and additional patrols were scheduled. The incident had revealed vulnerabilities that needed attention, and the staff took their responsibilities seriously. At the same time, Charlotte was comforted and reassured. She was praised for her curiosity and bravery, even as she was gently reminded to stay within safe areas. Her cheerful nature returned, but with a subtle awareness of the limits around her. Edward spent the evening reflecting on the day. He walked slowly through a quiet garden, the golden light of late afternoon casting long shadows. He thought about Charlotte, about the staff, and about his mother. He thought about how quickly a day could change, how an ordinary morning could become a lesson in life and responsibility. The thrill of adventure was still there, but it was tempered now by understanding and reflection. He realized that being careful, aware, and thoughtful was part of growing up, part of becoming someone who could be trusted and relied upon. Later, in a private moment with Camilla, Edward expressed his feelings quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said softly. Camilla smiled gently, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I know," she said, "but you need to remember that good intentions are not always enough. You are part of a family and a world where your choices matter. That is a responsibility, and it is a privilege as well as a challenge. Learn from this and you will grow stronger." Edward nodded, feeling the weight and the wisdom of her words. The day ended with a quiet dinner, the family together in a calm and reflective mood. Charlotte chatted cheerfully about her games and the butterfly she had followed, while Edward remained thoughtful, occasionally offering quiet observations. The palace had survived a frightening morning, and everyone had learned valuable lessons. Edward understood that curiosity needed to be balanced with caution, and Charlotte had a gentle awareness of boundaries. The staff had proven their vigilance, and the palace as a whole had responded effectively to an unexpected challenge. By the time night fell, Edward was alone in his room, thinking deeply. The events of the day had left a mark on him. He realized that growing up in a world of privilege came with unique responsibilities, and that even small mistakes could have far-reaching consequences. He understood now that being part of a family like his meant that every action mattered, and that thoughtfulness, awareness, and care were essential qualities to cultivate. For Edward, the morning's events had been a turning point, a moment where innocence met responsibility, curiosity met consequence, and lessons were learned that would guide him for the rest of his life. The days following Princess Charlotte's brief disappearance were tense and filled with careful scrutiny. Edward felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him more than ever. What had started as a harmless adventure had transformed into a lesson in accountability, one he could not ignore. Camilla watched him closely, knowing that the moment demanded guidance, not punishment alone. It was clear that this was a turning point in Edward's young life, a moment where he would learn that curiosity must be balanced with careful thought and responsibility. The palace held a private meeting with the senior advisors, security personnel, and Camilla. They reviewed the events of that morning in meticulous detail. Every movement, every decision, every small action was analyzed to understand how the breach had occurred and how it could be prevented in the future. The security team made recommendations for additional precautions, including reinforced gates, closer supervision in certain areas, and stricter protocols for the children. The advisors emphasized that the incident, while ultimately resolved without harm, had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Edward sat quietly outside the room, aware that his name was being mentioned in every conversation. He could feel the seriousness in the tone of the adults' voices. They spoke with precision and calmness, but each word carried weight. It became clear to Edward that the palace, the staff, and his family were all deeply concerned about the implications of his actions. It was not just about rules. It was about trust, safety, and the reputation of the family. The realization settled over him, making him reflect deeply on the consequences of a single moment of carelessness. Later that afternoon, Camilla asked Edward to join her in a private room. She spoke to him gently but with firmness. "Edward," she said, "you must understand that what happened was serious. Charlotte was safe, thankfully, but it could have been very different. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences affect more than just yourself. You must take this seriously." Edward nodded, his eyes downcast. He felt a mixture of guilt, regret, and understanding. He had known that the incident was significant, but hearing it articulated by his mother made it real in a way he could not ignore. In the days that followed, Edward's privileges were carefully reviewed. While Camilla wanted to maintain his dignity and support his growth, the palace advisors agreed that some consequences were necessary. Certain ceremonial duties were temporarily suspended, and Edward was restricted from accessing specific areas of the palace unsupervised. These measures were not intended as punishment alone, but as tools to teach him responsibility, awareness, and the importance of following rules. Edward accepted them quietly, understanding that these restrictions were meant to help him grow rather than shame him. The decision to temporarily limit Edward's public roles was also communicated to a few senior officials outside the palace. Though the incident had not reached the media in a harmful way, it was important for advisors and staff to understand the changes. Edward's responsibilities would be monitored more closely, and he would be encouraged to participate in structured programs designed to teach accountability and decision-making. These programs included exercises in careful observation, planning, and understanding the implications of choices before acting. Edward, though initially disappointed, began to see the value in these measures. He realized that he had been given an opportunity to reflect and improve. The palace staff worked with him, helping him understand not only the rules, but why the rules existed in the first place. Each discussion emphasized the importance of awareness, foresight, and thinking about the safety of others. Edward listened carefully, absorbing the lessons and applying them in small, deliberate ways. Charlotte, on the other hand, was treated with gentle reassurance. She had been unharmed, and her cheerful spirit returned quickly. But even for her, the experience had left a mark. She became slightly more cautious in her movements around the palace and began to notice boundaries more carefully. The staff made sure to maintain a balance between safety and freedom, allowing her to explore and play, but with awareness and guidance. Charlotte's innocence remained intact, but she learned the importance of being mindful of her surroundings. In private conversations, Edward spoke openly with Camilla about his feelings. "I didn't think it would be so serious," he admitted. "I thought I was just exploring. I didn't mean to scare anyone or cause trouble." Camilla nodded, understanding his perspective. "I know, Edward. You were curious, and curiosity is not wrong, but it must be guided by responsibility. The palace, your family, and Charlotte depend on you to think carefully. That is part of growing up in our world." Edward absorbed her words, feeling a deeper sense of duty than he had ever experienced before. The palace also took the opportunity to review general safety measures. Guards and staff were reminded to remain vigilant, ensuring that gates and restricted areas were secured at all times. Training sessions were organized for both children and staff, emphasizing awareness, communication, and careful planning. Though the incident had been resolved safely, it became a moment for reflection and improvement across the household. Everyone involved recognized that a small oversight could have led to serious consequences, and they worked together to ensure it would not happen again. Edward's restricted duties were gradually paired with constructive tasks. He was encouraged to participate in exercises that required careful thought, patience, and attention to detail. These tasks included helping plan small events, assisting in organizing daily schedules, and observing procedures closely. Each activity was designed to teach him the value of foresight, consideration, and accountability. Slowly, Edward began to see the benefits of these exercises, understanding that responsibility could be empowering rather than limiting. Camilla continued to mentor Edward through these lessons, offering guidance and encouragement. She emphasized that mistakes were a part of growing up, but learning from them was what mattered most. Edward began to reflect on the incident not with shame alone, but with understanding and determination. He recognized that he had the power to make better choices in the future, and that true maturity involved thinking ahead and considering the impact of every decision. As the weeks passed, Edward's behavior improved noticeably. He moved more carefully through the palace, paying attention to boundaries and rules. He demonstrated patience and thoughtfulness in small tasks, and his interactions with Charlotte became more protective and considerate. The experience had left a lasting impression on him, shaping not only his actions but also his mindset. Edward had learned a valuable lesson in accountability, one that would stay with him long after the memory of that morning faded. The incident also strengthened the bond between Edward and Camilla. She continued to provide support and guidance, helping him navigate the responsibilities and expectations that came with their world. Edward, in turn, began to appreciate the wisdom and care of his mother in new ways. He understood that her guidance was not about control, but about helping him grow into someone who could be trusted, respected, and responsible. Meanwhile, Charlotte remained cheerful and playful, but with a subtle awareness of caution. She noticed small details in her surroundings, learned to stay close to safe areas, and developed a quiet understanding of the importance of guidance and supervision. Her innocence remained intact, but she had grown slightly, absorbing lessons about safety and awareness in her own gentle way. By the end of this period, the palace had returned to its normal rhythm. The incident, though serious, had become a turning point for Edward. He had experienced the consequences of a momentary lapse in judgment, but he had also learned the value of responsibility, accountability, and careful thinking. The experience had shaped him, teaching him lessons that would guide his actions in the future. Edward's journey of growth was not complete, but the first steps had been taken. He had faced the consequences of his actions, understood the importance of rules, and learned to consider the impact of his choices on those around him. The palace, too, had strengthened its systems and procedures, ensuring that such an incident would be less likely to occur again. Together, they had turned a moment of fear and uncertainty into an opportunity for growth, reflection, and improvement. In quiet moments, Edward often reflected on that morning. He remembered the thrill of exploring, the excitement of curiosity, and the sudden shift to fear and responsibility. He realized that life was full of choices, and that each choice had the potential to shape the world around him. The incident had been frightening, but it had also been a powerful teacher, showing him the value of thoughtfulness, vigilance, and care. Through it all, Camilla remained by his side, guiding him with patience and understanding. She knew that Edward's journey was just beginning, and that each lesson learned would help him grow into a responsible, thoughtful, and capable young man. The events of that morning, though frightening, had become a foundation for growth, shaping Edward in ways that would influence his life for years to come. The weeks after Edward's incident passed slowly but meaningfully. The palace had returned to its usual rhythm, yet a subtle shift had taken place within its walls. Edward moved more deliberately now, aware that each step, each choice, carried weight. The restrictions placed on his ceremonial duties remained, not as punishment alone, but as a guide to help him grow. He learned to see boundaries not as obstacles but as tools for safety and responsibility. The palace staff noticed the change in him, quietly impressed by the young boy who had begun to navigate the world with a new level of awareness. Camilla continued her careful mentorship, walking alongside Edward as he faced the challenges of daily life in a world where curiosity and responsibility often collided. She spoke to him gently but firmly, reminding him that mistakes were not failures if they were acknowledged and learned from. "Edward," she said one afternoon as they strolled through the palace gardens, "what matters most is not that you made a mistake, but that you understand it, learn from it, and grow. That is what makes a person truly strong." Edward listened intently, feeling a sense of purpose in her words that had been missing before. The young boy began to approach his responsibilities with a newfound seriousness. Simple tasks, such as helping organize the library, assisting in planning small events, or following security protocols during walks around the palace grounds, became exercises in mindfulness. Edward discovered that paying attention to detail, thinking ahead, and anticipating outcomes were not limitations, but skills that made him feel capable and mature. Slowly, he began to earn back the trust that had been tested during the incident. Charlotte, too, had learned subtle lessons from the event. Though her cheerful and playful nature returned quickly, she began to develop an awareness of her surroundings. She learned to recognize the importance of boundaries, to stay near familiar areas, and to communicate clearly with the adults who cared for her. Edward noticed these changes in his sister, realizing that the responsibility to protect and guide her was now part of his role as her older brother. This awareness gave him a sense of purpose he had not felt before, a motivation that extended beyond himself. As time passed, Edward began to reflect more deeply on the morning that had caused such chaos. He thought about the choices he had made, the excitement that had led him away from safety, and the relief he felt when Charlotte was found unharmed. The experience, though frightening, had become a powerful teacher. He realized that life offered lessons in unexpected ways, and that true growth often came from moments that challenged one's understanding, courage, and patience. The palace recognized Edward's progress, gradually reintegrating him into limited ceremonial duties while maintaining careful supervision. These roles were designed to help him build confidence, judgment, and responsibility. Edward embraced these opportunities with a sense of determination. He paid attention to the expectations placed upon him, striving to demonstrate thoughtfulness and maturity. Though the shadow of the incident lingered, it became a source of motivation rather than fear, a reminder of the importance of careful choices and the consequences they could bring. Camilla continued to offer guidance in everyday moments. She emphasized empathy, understanding the impact of one's actions on others, and the importance of honesty. Edward learned that responsibility was not just about rules and supervision, but about caring for those around him and thinking beyond immediate desires. Slowly, he began to internalize these lessons, recognizing that his curiosity, when paired with careful thought, could lead to positive outcomes rather than danger. Edward also developed a quiet sense of pride in the changes he had made. He felt more capable, aware, and confident in his ability to navigate the palace and its responsibilities. The lessons from that morning became a foundation for his growth, teaching him skills that went beyond rules and supervision. He learned to anticipate outcomes, evaluate risks, and consider the well-being of others before acting. These skills, though born of a frightening experience, became tools that shaped his character in meaningful ways. The palace staff, too, took note of Edward's progress. They observed his increased attentiveness, his careful consideration of actions, and his willingness to learn from mistakes. The near miss of Charlotte's disappearance had been a test not only for Edward but for the household as a whole. The staff recognized the importance of guidance, patience, and structured learning in shaping young members of the family. Their dedication to Edward's growth became a subtle but powerful support system, reinforcing the lessons he had begun to internalize. Edward's relationship with Charlotte also deepened. He became more protective, patient, and attentive, understanding that his actions could directly affect her safety and well-being. They spent time together exploring the gardens, playing games, and reading stories, but Edward now maintained a quiet awareness of boundaries and caution. Charlotte, in turn, learned to communicate more openly with her brother, trusting him while also exercising her own awareness. Together, they began to navigate their world with a shared understanding of safety, responsibility, and care. The lessons of that morning extended beyond the palace grounds. Edward began to apply them in other areas of his life, in schoolwork, interactions with friends, and small responsibilities at home. He discovered that awareness, patience, and thoughtful decision-making were valuable not only in moments of potential danger, but in everyday life. He began to approach challenges with a sense of calm and preparation, considering the possible outcomes before acting. The experience had transformed him, instilling skills and values that would guide him for years to come. Camilla observed Edward with a quiet sense of pride. She saw a young boy who had faced the consequences of his actions, reflected on his mistakes, and taken meaningful steps toward growth. Though the incident had been frightening and challenging, it had become a turning point, a moment that shaped character, responsibility, and maturity. She knew that Edward's journey was ongoing, but she felt confident that the lessons he had learned would remain with him, influencing his choices and shaping the person he would become. The palace, as a whole, also reflected on the incident with careful thought. The near miss had served as a reminder that vigilance, awareness, and guidance were essential in maintaining safety and order. Policies were refined, security measures reinforced, and staff were reminded of the importance of their roles. The experience became a reference point for future training, emphasizing that even moments of curiosity and innocence required careful supervision and thoughtful planning. Over time, Edward's confidence returned, not in the reckless way of before, but in a measured, responsible sense. He had learned that true courage involved foresight, consideration, and care for others. His curiosity remained, but it was now guided by reflection and thoughtfulness. He explored, played, and learned, but always with awareness and responsibility in mind. The lessons from that morning became a permanent part of his character, shaping how he approached the world around him. In quiet moments, Edward reflected on the journey he had undergone. He remembered the fear, the excitement, and the lessons learned. He realized that mistakes were not failures but opportunities for growth, that responsibility could be empowering, and that the well-being of others required attention, care, and thoughtful choices. These reflections gave him confidence, a sense of purpose, and a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. Camilla continued to guide Edward, fostering his growth while providing support, encouragement, and wisdom. She emphasized that life was full of challenges, and that the ability to learn from experiences, face consequences, and make better choices was what defined character. Edward listened, absorbed, and applied these lessons, understanding that the journey of growth was ongoing and that each day offered opportunities to practice responsibility and care. Charlotte, too, benefited from the experience. She remained cheerful and playful, but with a subtle awareness of her surroundings and an understanding of the importance of guidance. The bond between the siblings strengthened, built on mutual trust, care, and the shared lessons of that morning. Together, they learned to navigate their world with awareness, curiosity, and responsibility, balancing freedom with safety, playfulness with consideration. By the end of the period, Edward had transformed in ways that were visible to everyone around him. He had faced the consequences of his actions, reflected on his mistakes, and taken meaningful steps toward growth. The incident that had begun as a frightening moment had become a powerful teacher, shaping his character, mindset, and approach to life. He had learned lessons in accountability, empathy, and careful decision-making, lessons that would remain with him forever. The palace had returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of the incident remained. It was no longer a source of fear, but a marker of growth, a reminder that even moments of uncertainty and challenge could become opportunities for learning and transformation. Edward had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware, ready to face the world with courage, responsibility, and care. In quiet reflection, Edward understood the full meaning of the lessons he had learned. He realized that curiosity was a gift, responsibility was a privilege, and growth came from facing challenges with honesty, thoughtfulness, and care for others. The experience had shaped him, guided him, and prepared him for the future. Edward had learned that life was not simply about rules or restrictions, but about understanding the impact of his actions and making choices that reflected awareness, care, and maturity.